Welcome to Attic Static. Tonight we have 18 stories for you, including the Chalkline Visitor, the Second Pulse, the Patient in the Gap, and more. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the rain carry you. The Chalkline Visitor, September 14th. To the person who finds this, I hope you aren't looking for me, but I need you to know why I stopped moving. I lived in the Slot Canyon for 3 years, a vertical world of sandstone and silence. The walls were so close together that I could reach out and touch both sides at once, and the floor was a smooth, river-washed basin. It was perfect until I noticed the chalk. Every morning, when the first light hit the canyon floor, there would be a single mark. It was a perfect X made of white dust, positioned exactly 3 feet from the center of the floor. I didn't live with anyone. I didn't have a pet. Yet, every dawn, the X appeared as if something had stepped into my room, paused, and marked its territory before retreating into the shadows of the towering stone walls. By the second week, the marks changed. They weren't just X's anymore. They were small, jagged triangles. By the third week, the marks were tiny, perfect circles. I began to realize that the marks weren't just random. They were getting larger every single day, and the dust was becoming more vibrant, shifting from a dusty white to a deep, bruised violet. Then came the sound. It wasn't a footfall. It was a rhythmic, wet clicking, like a tongue hitting the roof of a mouth, but it didn't come from the floor. It came from above. I spent my days staring at the ceiling, trying to catch a glimpse of the architect of the chalk. I started to see it during the twilight hours. It didn't walk like a human. It moved across the underside of the canyon roof like a beetle on its side, but with a strange, undulating grace. It had a body made of segmented, iridescent plates that looked like polished river stones. It didn't have legs in the traditional sense. Instead, it had 6 jointed limbs that ended in soft, suction cup pads. It moved with a series of rapid, pulsing ripples, its body folding and unfolding as it glided along the stone. It was heavy, yet it seemed to defy gravity, clinging to the ceiling as if it were walking on a flat plane. It had no face in the way we think of faces. Instead, it had a cluster of 3 glowing, amber nodules that pulsed with light and a wide, serrated mouth that stayed partially open. One night, I stayed awake until the moon reached its zenith. I heard the clicking grow louder, faster. The air grew heavy with the scent of crushed mint and old copper. Suddenly, the clicking stopped. The silence was so thick it felt like a weight on my chest. Then I felt a vibration in the stone. The entity was moving toward me, but it didn't drop down. It stayed on the ceiling, creeping closer and closer, its amber nodules glowing brighter as it approached. I could see the segments of its shell shifting, the plates overlapping like a deck of cards. It reached the spot directly above my head and stayed there, its 3 nodules pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm. It felt as though it were observing my very thoughts. Then, the flash flood sirens began to wail from the canyon's mouth, a low, mourning moan that vibrated through the rock. The water began to rise from the floor, a thin sheet of silver. But the entity didn't flinch. It stayed perfectly still on the ceiling, its amber lights dimming. Just as the water reached my waist, it finally let go of the ceiling. It didn't fall. It drifted downward like a feather, landing on the surface of the water. It opened its serrated mouth and emitted a single, resonant hum that shook the very walls. Then, it reached out with one of its jointed limbs and drew a final mark on the water's surface. It was a long, straight line. The water froze for a split second, then the flood surged forward, swallowing the mark, the entity, and me. When the water receded, the canyon was silent. The floor was dry again, save for one perfect, straight line of violet chalk that remained where the entity had touched it. I am still here, but the X's have stopped. Now, there is only the line, and the knowledge that it is waiting for the next time the water rises. The Second Pulse. I didn't realize my sleep cycle had been compromised until the data logs began to flicker on my tablet. It started as a minor anomaly in my REM cycle, a rhythmic hitch in my breathing that didn't match my own lungs. By the 3rd night in room 412 of the Pineview Motel, the tracker began to register a second heartbeat. It was faint at first, a thrumming vibration beneath my own, but it grew steadier as the night deepened. It was located precisely 3 inches behind my left ear. I woke up at 2:14 a.m. to the sound of a soft, wet sliding noise. The motel wing was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioner, but the ice machine alcove at the far end of the hallway seemed to be breathing. I sat up, the springs of the mattress groaning. The air felt heavy, smelling of old linen and a strange, metallic sweetness. When I swung my legs out of bed, I saw it. Standing in the alcove was a figure that shouldn't have been able to stand so naturally. It didn't have a skeleton made of rigid bone. Instead, its body seemed to be composed of a dense, velvet-like muscle that allowed it to curve in ways a human body could never manage. It was currently folded into a position where its ribcage was tucked inward, its torso twisting like a spool of silk, yet its limbs remained perfectly fluid. It moved toward me, not by walking, but by sliding. It didn't lift its feet. It flowed across the linoleum, its body rippling like a heavy curtain falling in a breeze. It stopped just before the edge of my bed. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense, but it possessed a wide, horizontal mouth that stretched from ear to ear. This was the smile your mother only learned after the accident, that wide, toothy grin that stayed fixed even when the rest of the face was still. It wasn't a smile of joy, it was a smile of completion. The figure reached out, its arm bending backward at the elbow to touch my shoulder. Its skin felt like warm wax. It didn't speak, but I felt its presence press against my mind, a sense of heavy, patient observation. I tried to pull away, but the second heartbeat synchronized with mine, creating a thumping resonance that vibrated in my teeth. I realized then that the figure wasn't just visiting, it was anchoring itself to me. It began to lean closer, its body unfolding from its compact shape into a tall, elegant arch. It moved with a grace that felt predatory yet graceful, its limbs lengthening and shortening as it navigated the small space. It reached out with a hand that had too many knuckles, its palm pressing against my cheek. The smile widened, the corners of the mouth pulling so high they almost touched the bridge of its nose. I could hear the second heartbeat now, louder than my own, a steady, wet thud. It was the sound of something waiting for its turn to breathe for both of us. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore the way its weight began to lean into my chest. The figure's body began to flatten, its muscles expanding to mold against my own frame. It wasn't a ghost or a dream. It was a physical weight, a presence that had claimed the vacancy of my shadow. I felt its mouth open slightly, not to speak, but to exhale a breath that tasted of crushed violets and damp earth. It held me there for a long minute, its body rippling against mine, perfectly still. Then, with a final, smooth slide, it retreated into the shadows of the alcove, its body coiling back into that impossible, folded shape. I lay there in the dark, the second heartbeat finally fading into a dull hum. The room was silent again, but as I drifted back into a shallow sleep, I felt the warmth of its palm still lingering on my skin. I realized that while the figure was back in its alcove, it hadn't quite let go of me entirely. When I finally woke at dawn, the first thing I noticed wasn't the light or the sound of the morning. It was the sensation of a faint, rhythmic pulse still vibrating against my temple, even though the figure was nowhere to be seen. It was as if the second heartbeat had decided to stay behind, waiting for the next time. The lights went out. The patient in the gap. The emergency lights in the hospital elevator didn't glow so much as they hummed, a low amber vibration that felt heavy against my skin. It was 3:14 a.m., and the lift had groaned to a halt exactly halfway between the 3rd and 4th floors. I was alone, or so I thought, until I noticed the brass plate on the sidewall. Someone had scratched a single word into the metal: wait. The letters were shaky, almost human. I sighed, leaning my head against the cool metal, but as the minutes ticked by, I realized I wasn't just hearing the silence. I was hearing a rhythmic, wet clicking, like a clock made of cartilage. When the clicking stopped, I saw it. In the corner of the ceiling, tucked into the shadows where the cables met the frame, was a creature. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Its body was composed of distinct, horizontal slices of flesh, each a different vibrant hue: ruby red, ochre yellow, deep violet, and a startling neon cyan. It looked as though a painter had taken a human form and sliced it into a perfect color bar, each layer perfectly flat. It had no mouth, yet it emitted a constant, unbroken tone, a steady, haunting that didn't fluctuate in pitch, vibrating the very air of the cramped box. It didn't move at first. It just hung there, a stack of colored meat. But as the elevator remained suspended, the creature began to pulse. Every time it pulsed, it would drift an inch closer to me. On the second minute, it hovered near the back wall. On the fourth, it was above my shoulder. Then, the handwriting began to appear. I noticed a small scrap of paper fluttering from the creature's side. It had a single line written in ink, "I am here." I reached out to touch it, but the creature drifted further. The next time I looked at the paper, the handwriting had changed. It was still the same words, but the letters were slightly wider, the ink bleeding a bit more. I felt a prickle of unease. I whispered, "Are you hungry?" The creature didn't move its mouth, but the unbroken tone shifted slightly deeper. It drifted another foot forward, almost touching my hair. The scrap of paper floated down again. The handwriting was now bold and thick, the letters stretching outward as if they were trying to reach the edges of the page. It felt as though the words were growing heavy. By the 10th minute, the creature was inches from my face. The color bars of its body seemed to glow with an internal light. The tone was now so loud it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. I could see the texture of the slices. Each one had a slightly different grain, like layers of polished wood. Then, the paper fell one last time. I stared at it, my breath hitching. The handwriting was no longer just bold, it was frantic. The letters were massive, sprawling so far across the paper that they overlapped, nearly merging into a single, jagged shape. It was no longer a neat sentence. It was a scream captured in ink. I realized then that the creature wasn't just drifting toward me, it was expanding. The color bars were widening, the red and violet layers beginning to overlap my own skin. The unbroken tone reached a crescendo, a vibrating hum that made my teeth ache. The elevators suddenly lurched. The cables groaned, and with a violent jolt, the lift began to rise again. As we ascended, the creature didn't fall. It stayed locked in place, perfectly level with my eyes. The scrap of paper fell one final time, landing in my palm. The handwriting was so large that it had almost run out of room, the ink finally breaking into a single, tiny dot at the very bottom. I looked up at the creature, and for the first time, it changed. It didn't open a mouth, but it shifted its entire weight, leaning its colorful bulk against my forehead. The tone stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like being underwater. I looked at the paper again. The handwriting was no longer drifting. It was perfectly centered, tiny and sharp as a needle. It read, "Now." I felt a cold, wet sensation on my brow as the creature pressed its final color bar against my skin, and I realized that while I was the one who had been waiting, it was the one who had been waiting for me to be ready to be replaced. The recipe for a stolen gate. To prepare a proper encounter with the architect of the threshold, you must first gather the ingredients of a perfectly silent house. Find a new development, one where the grass is still uniform and the gravel hasn't yet been crushed by heavy tires. Select a model home, a structure of fresh timber and pristine carpet, devoid of the messy clutter of actual living. It must be empty, save for the lingering scent of sawdust and new paint. Once the sun dips below the horizon, enter the front door. Do not rush. Let your footsteps be the only percussion in the stillness. Walk into the foyer. Notice how the light from the hallway sconce spills across the floor, creating a pool of amber. This is your starting point. As you move into the living room, you will notice the first ingredient of the haunting, the shadow of the man in the doorway. He does not appear until you have fully crossed the threshold into the next room. He is not a ghost in the traditional sense. He is a silhouette of heavy, velvet-textured darkness. He has a broad, rectangular torso and a head that looks like a smooth, rounded stone. He possesses no visible facial features, yet you can sense his focus. Continue your journey into the dining area. The shadow is still there, standing in the doorway of the living room you just left. It is patient. It does not move until you reach the halfway point of the next room. Observe the way his shadow behaves. It is not a mere projection of his body, it is a pioneer. He is a man of anticipation. His shadow takes each step a heartbeat before he does. When you move your left foot forward, his shadow has already landed on the floor. When you reach for a chair, his shadow has already gripped the wood. Step into the kitchen. The shadow has moved to the doorway of the dining room. It is growing more distinct. You will notice that while he is a silhouette, his edges are slightly frayed, like the teeth of a saw. He doesn't just sit in the doorway, he seems to lean into the space you are about to occupy. You feel a slight pressure in the air, a subtle tug of gravity pulling you toward the direction he has already traveled. Now, walk toward the master bedroom. The shadow is in the kitchen doorway. It is larger now, taller. You realize that he is not just following you, he is mimicking your intent with a slight delay. He is the echo of your motion. If you walk slowly, he waits with a regal, heavy stillness. If you walk quickly, his shadow stretches out, lunging forward to meet your feet like a hungry predator catching a falling fruit. Reach the bedroom and stand in the center of the rug. The shadow is in the kitchen doorway, but it is starting to flicker. It is no longer a perfect silhouette. It has started to develop a texture, a deep, mottled grain like the bark of an ancient oak. He is preparing to join you. Walk toward the final hallway. The shadow is in the bedroom doorway. It is no longer just a shape, it has become a weight. You can hear a faint, rhythmic thrumming, the sound of a heart beating just behind the veil of the wall. Finally, stand before the bathroom door. The shadow is in the bedroom doorway, but it is no longer waiting. It has begun to move on its own, creeping toward the edge of the frame. It is no longer just a shadow of a man. It is the shadow of a man who is about to become your shadow. Take the final step into the bathroom. The shadow is no longer in the doorway. It has leaped. It is now standing directly in front of you, occupying the space of the tile floor. It has no body, only a presence. It is a man of ink and intent. Look down at your own feet. You will see that your own shadow has begun to change. It is no longer a perfect match for your limbs. It is becoming slightly heavier, slightly more textured, and it is beginning to move a fraction of a second before you do. Now leave the house. Walk out the front door and keep walking until the model home is a speck in the distance. Do not look back, for if you do, you will see him standing in the doorway of the house, his shadow, reaching out to catch your own. But as you reach for the handle of the door to return home, you realize the shadow reaching out is no longer his. It is yours, stretching back toward the house to claim the man who left it behind. To prepare a proper encounter with the architect of the threshold, you must first gather the ingredients of a perfectly silent house. The toll of the misplaced head. The bridge is a concrete spine connecting the sleeping suburbs to the heart of the city, but at 3 a.m, it feels like a floating island of solitude. I sat in my sedan at toll booth 4, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the expansion joints providing the only soundtrack to my late-night commute. My navigation app, a reliable blue icon on my dashboard, had been chirping incessantly for the last hour. It was supposed to be a straight shot, yet every few minutes, the blue line would jerk and recalibrate, forcing me to veer off the main artery. It wasn't just a suggestion. The app seemed to be demanding a detour. Each time I corrected my path, the GPS would pulse with a soft, amber light and reroute me toward a single point, a lonesome, crooked house nestled in a thicket of weeping willows just off the bridge's southern span. It was a house that shouldn't have been there, a Victorian skeleton of charcoal wood and cracked glass. I ignored it twice, but on the third pass, the app began to vibrate with a frantic intensity. The voice of the GPS, usually a crisp feminine tone, began to warp. Take the side path, it whispered, the syllables stretching like taffy. The house is waiting. I sighed and turned the wheel. The road narrowed, the asphalt turning into packed dirt. As I approached the house, the atmosphere grew heavy, as if the air itself had thickened into a syrup. The house stood perfectly still, its front door slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of deep, velvety shadow. Suddenly, the GPS chimed a high, crystalline note. "Enter the house," it commanded. I parked the car and stepped out. The silence was absolute. I walked toward the door, but as I reached for the brass handle, the ground beneath my feet gave a subtle shudder. From the upstairs window, a shape appeared. It was a person-shaped thing, but its anatomy was a delicious catastrophe of geometry. It stood on two legs that were slightly too short, ending in wide, flat feet. Its torso was elongated, and instead of a head resting atop its neck, its head sat perched on its right shoulder. The face was a smooth expanse of porcelain-like skin, featuring a mouth that was a simple horizontal slit and two nostrils that flared with every breath. It had no ears, and its eyes were tiny, gold beads that didn't seem to blink. The thing didn't move at first. It simply leaned against the window frame, its head on shoulder looking down at me like a gargoyle observing a moth. I felt a strange compulsion to move toward it, a magnetic pull that made my muscles ache. I walked to the front door and pushed. It swung open with a soundless grace. Inside, the house was not empty. It was a labyrinth of corridors that seemed to fold into themselves. The GPS app on my phone, still held in my hand, began to glow with a pulsing white light. Step forward, it narrated. I walked into the foyer. The walls were lined with clocks, but none of them were ticking. They all showed different times, their hands frozen in permanent protest. At the end of the hall stood the person-shaped thing. It had moved from the window. Now it stood in the center of the room, its head on shoulder bobbing slightly as if it were listening to the house itself. I reached out a hand, my breath hitching in my throat. The entity didn't reach back. Instead, it rotated its entire torso, bringing its shoulder head closer to my face. It didn't have a neck to swivel, so the movement was deliberate and heavy. I could smell something faint, the scent of old paper and ozone. "Why are you here?" I whispered. The thing didn't speak, but the GPS app in my hand suddenly erupted with a new line of text, replacing the voice, because the path is incomplete. The entity took a step forward. Its gait was strange, a side-to-side shuffle that made its shoulder head swing like a pendulum. I realized then that it wasn't just a creature, it was a landmark. The house was a pause in the journey, a physical manifestation of a detour. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to touch its face. As my fingers brushed the porcelain skin, the house groaned. The floorboards beneath me shifted, and the walls began to lean inward. The person-shaped thing opened its mouth, the horizontal slit widening into a perfect O. A low hum vibrated through my teeth. The app flickered one last time, the blue line finally reaching its destination. I took a final step, my chest pressing against the entity's torso. Then, the house vanished. I was standing on the bridge again, my car idling in front of Toll Booth 4. The house was gone, and the GPS was silent. I sat in the driver's seat, my heart hammering against my ribs, looking at the empty road ahead. I felt a warmth on my shoulder, as if something was still leaning against me. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a faint, wet smudge of porcelain-colored dust on my collar, and I realized that while the house was gone, the thing had left a piece of itself behind to ensure I would never forget the detour. The rehearsal of the vault. The air at 4,000 feet doesn't just sit, it weighs. It presses against your skin with the cold persistence of a wet wool blanket, smelling of pine resin and frozen stone. I was the only soul left on the peak, tucked inside the copper-domed observatory. Outside, the world was a monochromatic void, but inside, the great telescope stood like a skeletal giant, its brass gears groaning as I adjusted the focus. It was 3:14 a.m., that hollow hour when the silence becomes so profound you can hear the blood rushing through your own ears. I was recording the shift of Andromeda, my pen scratching against the parchment, until the first vibration hit the floorboards. It wasn't a sound, exactly. It was a pulse, a rhythmic shudder that suggested something massive was shifting just beyond the circle of the lamplight. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. Then I saw it. It wasn't a full reveal, but a fracture in the periphery of my vision. A shape moved, not a walk, not a crawl, but a sudden, violent leap. It was a creature of iridescent scales, the color of oil on water, possessing a crown of weeping antlers that looked like frosted coral. It was suspended in the air, caught in a permanent state of mid-bound, as if the laws of gravity had simply decided to pause on its body. It was perfectly still, hovering 3 feet above the stone floor, its tail a plume of stiff feathers. I blinked and it was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a stray shadow cast by the rotating dome. But then, the rhythm started again. Each time I looked toward the corner near the primary lens, the creature would appear, frozen in a different stage of its leap. It didn't just move, it rehearsed. It would leap toward me, then stop. It would leap toward the ceiling, then freeze. It was practicing its arrival. I began to notice a peculiar detail. Every time I blinked, the creature shifted its position by exactly 3 inches forward. It wasn't just jumping, it was measuring the distance between its current home and my face. I tried to focus on the telescope, but the creature began to change its rehearsal. It was no longer just jumping, it was mimicking my movements. When I reached for a brass knob, the creature would leap into a pose that suggested it was also reaching. When I took a sharp breath, it would arch its back, its coral antlers shimmering under the oil lamp. It was learning the geometry of my existence. The silence of the observatory began to feel heavy, thick with the creature's concentration. It was practicing for a moment that hadn't happened yet. I felt its presence more than I saw it now, a low hum of energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. I realized that while I was the observer, I was also the subject. The creature was perfecting the art of the approach. It moved with a strange, jerky grace, its oil-slick scales reflecting the warm glow of the lamp. It would leap, hang in the air like a suspended thought, and then wait. I found myself holding my breath, terrified that if I moved too quickly, I would ruin its rehearsal. I sat perfectly still on my stool, my hand hovering over the final page of my notes. The creature was getting faster, its leaps becoming more deliberate. It was no longer just exploring the room, it was narrowing its focus. It began to leap in a sequence, a choreography of motion. It jumped left, then right, then curved inward toward the center of the room. With every leap, it got closer. It was no longer hovering in the distance. It was now just a few feet away, its coral antlers nearly brushing the hanging lantern. I could see the texture of its scales now, tiny, hexagonal plates that seemed to ripple like water. It was preparing for the final leap, the one that would close the gap entirely. It paused, suspended in the air, its tail feathers quivering. It looked at me with a single, wide eye that held the color of a bruised plum. It wasn't just a creature in a room, it was a performer awaiting its cue. It held its position for what felt like an eternity, a masterpiece. A frozen motion. Then, the rehearsed movements ended. It didn't jump toward me, it simply existed in the air, perfectly poised, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I realized then that it hadn't been practicing how to move through the room, but how to occupy the same space as me. The creature finally committed to the final leap. It didn't land with a thud. It moved with a silent, sweeping grace that bypassed the floor entirely. It surged forward, its body stretching until it was almost a blur of iridescent color. It didn't stop until its nose was an inch from my own. It didn't land on the ground, but it hovered there, vibrating with the effort of staying suspended. It was the final note of the rehearsal. The creature finally settled, its tail sweeping the floor as it let out a soft, whistling sigh. It had finished its practice. It had finally arrived. I stayed frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs, realizing that the rehearsal was over and the performance had truly begun. I looked up at its wide, plum-colored eye, and I saw that it wasn't just looking at me. It was waiting for me to move so it could see if I would react the way it had predicted. The resonance of Station 4. To the logistics team. If anyone finds this, please note that the atmospheric pressure in Sector 4 is stable, but the acoustics are peculiar. There is a low, constant hum vibrating through the floorboards. It isn't coming from the ventilation or the generators. It feels like it is coming from the ice itself. It is a steady, rhythmic thrum, almost like a distant beehive, but it seems to sync perfectly with my own pulse. Every time my heart beats, the hum vibrates in my teeth. It is comforting in a way, like a steady roommate. To the logistics team. The hum is getting louder. More importantly, it is changing. It started to mimic my heartbeat more aggressively this morning. When my pulse quickens because of a task, the hum races to keep up. It is no longer just a background noise. It feels like a physical presence, a pulse of energy moving through the walls. I find myself walking toward the source of the sound, even when the room is empty. It feels as though the hum is beckoning me. To the logistics team. I saw it today. Or I think I saw it. While I was calibrating the sensors, a ripple moved through the air, a distortion, like heat haze over a summer road. It didn't have a body, not exactly. It looked like a cluster of translucent, amber-colored spheres, roughly the size of marbles, held together by a web of shimmering, golden threads. It doesn't walk, it ripples. It sits in the corner of the laboratory now, vibrating at the exact frequency of my resting heart rate. It seems to be learning from me. To the logistics team. The spheres are growing. They are becoming more complex. They aren't just floating, they are pulsing in unison. When I am still, they are steady. When I am anxious, they spin faster, their golden threads tightening until they hum with a high-pitched whine. It is getting closer to me. I can feel the vibration in my ribs. It is no longer just a sound. It is a tactile sensation, a slight pressure against my chest, as if the hum is trying to press itself into my skin. To the logistics team. It is teaching me. That is the word for it. It isn't just mimicking my heart, it is teaching my heart to be more efficient. My pulse has become perfectly rhythmic, matching the sphere's rotation. My breathing has slowed down to match their expansion. Sometimes, when I am asleep, I can hear it whisper in a series of clicks. It isn't speech, but a sequence of vibrations that feel like a question. I find myself answering with a squeeze of my chest. To the logistics team. The spheres have started to move independently. One of them detached and began to orbit my head like a tiny, glowing moon. It hums a different note than the others, a sharp, staccato beat. It seems to be the leader. It follows me from room to room. When I am frustrated, it dances. When I am tired, it slows down to a crawl. It is becoming my shadow, my rhythmic twin. To the logistics team. I am starting to lose the distinction between my heartbeat and the hum. Sometimes, when I stop my own heart for a split second during a deep breath, the hum continues for a beat longer. It is as if it is holding my rhythm for me. It is becoming more solid, too. The amber spheres are no longer translucent. They are becoming opaque, like polished honey. They are starting to hum in a sequence that feels like a song, a low, mournful melody that resonates in my marrow. To the logistics team. It is no longer just in the room. It is in my lungs. When I inhale, the spheres expand. When I exhale, they contract. They are moving inside my ribcage now, orbiting my lungs like a swarm of tiny, singing planets. My pulse is no longer my own. It is a collaborative effort. I feel heavier, but more grounded. The hum is no longer a sound I hear. It is a feeling I inhabit. To the logistics team. The spheres are merging. They are starting to fuse together into a single, complex shape that mimics the curvature of my own heart. It is massive now, filling my chest cavity. It hums with such intensity that my skin vibrates. It is no longer a visitor, it is a tenant. I can feel it pushing against my ribs, trying to find more room. It is getting hungry for my rhythm. To the logistics team. It is finished. The hum has reached its final form. It has taken over my primary beat entirely. I no longer have to provide the rhythm. It provides the rhythm for me. My heart is just a vessel for its song. Tonight, I lay in bed and watched it. It is no longer just pulsing. It is expanding outward, filling the room with a golden, vibrating light. I am no longer the one listening to the hum. I am the one being played by it. I can feel it moving toward my head, seeking the last empty space. Final note, I am writing this as I feel the final sphere settle into my skull. It is no longer just a hum in my chest. It is a hum in my thoughts. As I read this, it is vibrating against my brain, and I can feel it starting to pulse in time with my own memories, rearranging them into its own perfect, rhythmic sequence. I am not just carrying the hum anymore. It is beginning to hum my name. And as it hums, my name begins to hum the hum. The threshold of the hidden step. The forest of Oakhaven doesn't just sit still, it breathes. As a surveyor, I have spent my life mapping the geometry of the world, recording the precise distance between oak and elm, the elevation of ridges, and the steady curve of streams. I carry a heavy field book. its leather cover scarred by years of moisture and dirt. My job is to translate the chaos of nature into the order of lines. But tonight, the land felt like it was rewriting its own blueprint while I watched. The search and rescue team called me out at 10 p.m. because a hiker had vanished in a patch of woods that, according to the local maps, should have been a flat meadow. Instead, it was a dense, suffocating thicket of cedar and pine. I moved through the timber with a flashlight, my boots crunching against the loam. The air was heavy, smelling of damp earth and something metallic, like a penny held in a warm palm. About an hour into the trek, I felt it. It wasn't a sound, but a pulse. Deep inside my ribcage, a rhythmic thrum began to echo. It was a heartbeat, steady and deliberate, but it wasn't my own. My own heart was racing with the exertion of the climb, but this secondary beat was slow, heavy, and perfectly synchronized with my footsteps. Each time my left foot hit the dirt, the pulse would thrum. Each time my right foot landed, it would shudder. It felt as though something was walking inside my chest, keeping time with my stride. I paused, holding my breath, but the pulse continued, undeterred by my stillness. It was a heavy, wet thud, like a leather ball hitting a drum. I checked my field book, trying to find a landmark to ground myself. The elevation should be steady here, I whispered to the trees. The pulse responded with a deep, resonant thump that seemed to vibrate my teeth. Then, the geometry of the woods began to warp. I reached a clearing where 3 towering cedars formed a triangle. According to my notes, there was a small ridge here, a subtle rise in the land. But as I stepped into the center of the clearing, my foot didn't meet a rise. It fell into a hollow that shouldn't have existed. My eyes scanned the ground, searching for the slope, but the earth remained perfectly flat. Yet, my muscles reacted as if I had just stepped down a significant flight of stairs. My knee bent, my torso leaned forward, and my balance shifted as if my foot had dropped 3 feet into the ground. I looked down. There was nothing but flat, mossy earth. My eyes saw a plain, but my feet remembered a descent. It was the first time I felt the land was lying to me. I took another step forward. My foot reached out, expecting the same level ground, but instead, it plunged into a sudden, vertical drop. Again, my body surrendered to a downward motion, my muscles tightening to accommodate a step that my vision could not confirm. I felt like a traveler moving through a house where the floorboards were invisible, only revealed by the soles of my boots. I began to walk faster, my pace becoming a frantic series of phantom steps. Every time I moved, my body performed a perfect, graceful descent, while my eyes reported a steady, horizontal plane. I was falling through a flat world. The pulse in my chest grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a heartbeat anymore, it was a countdown. The entity, the hidden step, was asserting its presence. It was a spatial anomaly, a fold in the fabric of the woods where the height existed in the memory of the earth, but not in the sight of the observer. I felt the ground beneath me begin to hum. I stopped, my heart pounding against the secondary pulse. I closed my eyes, trusting my feet more than my vision. In the darkness of my eyelids, the stairs felt real. They felt like polished stone, wide and smooth. I took one more step, and the world suddenly buckled. The flat ground finally caught up to the sensation of the fall. I felt my foot hit a solid, physical surface 3 feet below where my eyes said it should be. I lurched forward, my balance nearly destroyed by the sudden transition. I opened my eyes and gasped. The land had finally rearranged itself. The flat meadow was gone. In its place stood a literal, moss-covered staircase of stone, winding upward toward the canopy. The forest had finally decided to show me its secret. I stood on the 3rd step from the bottom, my breath hitching in the cold air. The pulse in my chest gave one final, massive thrum, and then went silent. The woods were still. I looked around at the stone steps, marveling at how they had been hidden right in front of me for so long. I reached out to touch the stone of the next step, but my hand trembled. As I looked down at the first step I had stood on, I realized the moss wasn't growing on the stone. It was growing in the shape of a footprint, exactly the size of my own. Then I felt a soft, cool pressure against my shoulder, as if something were leaning in to see what I was doing. I turned my head slightly, but saw nothing but the shadows of the cedars. Then the pulse returned, but it was no longer in my chest. It was coming from the stone step beneath my feet, a steady, rhythmic thrumming that suggested the stairs weren't just a path, but a resting place for something that was currently holding its breath. The staircase of the late echo. I didn't think it would be this big. The top level of the downtown parking garage is a concrete desert, a vast expanse of gray that smells of old exhaust and rain-damp dust. I was supposed to meet Sarah there at midnight, but she was running late, leaving me to wander the perimeter alone. I chose the far west staircase because the light from the street lamp above felt steady. It was a simple enough climb, 20 steps to the landing, I told myself. I began the ascent. Step, step, step. My boots made a rhythmic thud against the concrete. I was focused on the rhythm, my breathing steady. But as I reached the 10th step, my legs grew heavy. I felt that familiar, slight ache in my calves. I stopped counting. I just started walking. I reached the landing, but instead of the expected 20th step, there was an extra one. It wasn't there when I started. It was a shallow, new ledge of concrete, perfectly level with the rest. I frowned. Maybe I just miscounted. I took a deep breath and began again. Step, step, step. I was halfway up when the fatigue returned. My eyelids felt weighted, and I let the count slip. I just moved. When I reached the landing, I gasped. There were now 2 extra steps. They hadn't just appeared. They had settled into the flight, perfectly smooth and seamless. It felt like the staircase was exhaling, pushing out a new foothold every time my focus wavered. I started to move faster, trying to outrun my own tiredness. I didn't want to be caught off guard. I pushed my pace, my heart hammering against my ribs. I reached the landing again, and there were 4 extra steps. Then 6. Then 8. The staircase was growing, stretching out like a piece of taffy being pulled by invisible hands. I noticed then that the sound had changed. It wasn't just my boots anymore. Every time my heel hit the concrete, a split second later, there was a second thud. A softer, heavier sound. It followed my pace exactly, but it was delayed. It was as if my shadow had gained mass and was walking just behind me, mimicking my every motion. I stopped. The second thud stopped a heartbeat later. I took a tentative step forward. The echo followed. I turned my head to see it. It wasn't a shadow. It was a creature made of textured, bronze-colored skin that looked like hammered metal. It had no hair and no distinct ears. Its face was mostly smooth, dominated by a wide, horizontal slit for a mouth and a pair of wide, lidless eyes that were the color of tarnished copper. It didn't have hands so much as 3-jointed paddles. It moved with a strange, liquid grace, its body slightly compressed, as if it were trying to fold itself into the air. It was learning me. Every time I shifted my weight to the left, it waited for the tiniest fraction of a second before shifting its own mass. It was a perfect, slightly late mirror of my existence. I started to climb faster, my breath coming in short bursts. The staircase was expanding rapidly now, adding a step for every microsecond. I felt my energy dip. The flight was becoming a labyrinth of concrete. I could feel the fatigue creeping back in, that heavy, sinking feeling in my thighs. I tried to fight it, but the staircase won. It kept adding steps. The echo kept following. I could hear the creature's paddles clicking against the concrete, asterisk clack, clack, clack asterisk, always just a beat behind my own rhythm. I realized that if I stopped moving entirely, the creature would eventually catch up to my heels. I began to sprint. My muscles screamed. I wanted to reach the top level before the staircase grew into an infinite loop. I reached out, my hand trembling, trying to grab the next step, but it hadn't fully solidified yet. It was still shimmering like water. I could feel the creature closing in. It wasn't just mimicking my walk anymore. It was mimicking my posture, the way I leaned forward, the way my shoulders hunched. It was becoming a second version of me, a bronze twin made of copper and patience. I reached the final stretch, the last few steps of the flight. My lungs burned. I threw myself forward, landing on the top landing with a heavy thud. I stood up, my chest heaving, and looked back. The creature was there, standing just 2 feet behind me. It didn't move until I did. I stood perfectly still. It remained perfectly still. I exhaled a long, shaky breath. The creature moved its chest in the exact same way a second later. Then it did something it hadn't done yet. It took one step forward, independent of my movement. It moved toward me, its copper eyes widening. It didn't have a face for a smile, but the way its copper skin crinkled around the mouth slit suggested it was pleased. I stood there, paralyzed, as it reached out one of its 3-jointed paddles and touched my shoulder. It didn't just mimic the touch, it felt the pressure of my own hand. I looked at the staircase behind us. It had stopped growing, frozen in a jagged, uneven mess of extra steps. I realized then that the staircase hadn't been growing because of my fatigue. It had been growing because the creature was hungry for more ground to cover. It looked up at me, its copper eyes reflecting my own terrified face. It didn't wait for me to move. It moved first. I felt its weight lean into me, a heavy, metallic pressure. It was no longer just following my walk. It was preparing to take my place. The lag of the lake. Step closer, everyone, but mind the frost. The ice beneath your boots is no longer a solid floor. It is a drumhead, stretched thin by the transition from winter to spring. Can you hear it? That low, rhythmic groaning? It is the sound of the lake exhaling. Most people think of ice as a static thing, but on a night like this, it is alive. It shudders. It sighs. It remembers the weight of the water that sits beneath it, waiting for the thaw. We are standing on the edge of the Great Mirror, a frozen expanse that behaves differently than the rest of the valley. Usually, the water is still, but tonight, the surface is restless. It ripples without a breeze, as if something deep below is pushing upward against the glass of the frozen surface. I want you to look down at your own feet for a moment. See how the ice captures your silhouette? It is a perfect twin, a replica of your stance, your posture, your very soul caught in the crystalline grip of the lake. But watch closely. Most people expect their reflection to be a perfect slave to their movement. They expect the twin to mirror the master in real time. But here on the Great Mirror, the reflection has a mind of its own. It is a slight delay, a tiny hiccup in the logic of the world. When you lift your hand, your reflection waits. It waits for a heartbeat, a fraction of a second, and then it lifts its own. It is as if the image is traveling through a thick syrup before it reaches the surface. It is a lag in the reality of the ice. I saw it first when I was a boy, standing perfectly still by the shoreline. I blinked, and for a terrifying moment, my reflection stayed wide-eyed, staring back at me before its eyelids finally swept shut. It was a delay of a mere pulse, but it felt like a theft of time. Now, as we walk toward the center, look at the way the shadows stretch. They don't just fall, they linger. They hang in the air like wet paint, refusing to dry immediately. And look up. Above us, the sky is a bruised purple, but if you look at the underside of the ice canopy we are walking beneath, you will see the great stain. It started as a mere smudge of rust-colored pigment on the ceiling of the frozen world. It doesn't move like a creature, it breathes like a wound. It is a wet, mottled patch of ochre and deep copper, textured like velvet but damp to the touch. It has no shape yet, just a sprawling, irregular blotch that seems to absorb the moonlight. But as you watch it, the stain begins to organize itself. The edges of the blotch are fraying, pulling outward like melting wax. In the center, the texture is deepening, thickening into a series of ridges. It is becoming a mouth. It isn't a human mouth, not exactly. It is a wide, horizontal tear in the fabric of the ice, lined with rows of blunt, pebble-like teeth that look like smooth river stones. There are no lips, only a fleshy, corrugated rim that pulses with every groan of the lake. It doesn't speak in words, but in vibrations. It hums a low, resonant note that vibrates in your molars. It is the hunger of the lake made visible. Every time the ice groans, the stain widens. It is hungry for the symmetry of the world. It wants to pull the reflections down into the mud. Look at your reflection again. Notice how it is starting to lean forward, even though you are standing straight. It is eager. It is impatient. It wants to break free of the surface and join the stain above. As we reach the center, the groaning reaches a fever pitch. The ice is no longer just sighing. It is screaming in a frequency too low for the human ear to catch, but enough to make your hair stand on end. The stain on the ceiling is now a gaping, cavernous maw, dripping thick beads of amber resin that freeze before they hit the ground. It is watching us. It is waiting for the lag to finally disappear, for the reflection to catch up completely and pull itself out into our world. You might think the reflection is just a ghost of your body, but it is a prisoner of the ice. And that mouth above us? It is the door. It is waiting for the moment. When you stop moving and the reflection finally decides to take the lead. I can see it now in the center of the lake. The reflection of the great stain is stretching toward us, reaching out with a jagged rim of teeth. The ice cracked with a sound like a breaking bone, and for a second, the world went silent. Your reflection reached out first, its hand moving before yours did, grasping at the air. Then, the stain above opened wide, letting out a long, wet exhale that smelled of old earth and deep water. It didn't just take your reflection, it took the movement itself. You felt your arm twitch, a phantom sensation of being pulled upward, even as your physical body remained anchored to the ground. The lag was over. The reflection had finished its journey, and now it was the stain's turn to feast. You realized then that the reflection wasn't just mimicking you, it was rehearsing for the moment it would finally replace you. You stood there, perfectly still, while your reflection took one final, lingering step forward into the void of the ice, and the mouth above closed with a soft, wet click that signaled your turn to be swallowed. The Auditor of the Kitchen. I am currently translating the manuscript of The Last Supper of the Unseen, but the text is behaving erratically. It refuses to let me finish the third chapter because the ink seems to migrate across the page as if something is physically pulling it toward the margins. My notes suggest that the horror of this piece isn't found in the environment, but in the presence of the Auditor. I first noticed the Auditor during a sleepless night on the top deck of the municipal parking garage. It was 3 a.m., and the concrete expanse was bathed in a sickly, amber glow from the sodium lamps. I was sitting in my sedan, the engine off, watching the way the shadows stretched. That was when I saw it. The Auditor was standing near a concrete pillar about 20 feet away. It didn't look like a ghost. It looked like a collection of geometric accidents. It stood about 4 feet tall, with a body composed of interlocking, copper-colored metallic plates that shifted like scales. Instead of a face, it had a wide, circular bronze disc that hummed with a low vibration. It didn't move toward me, yet it felt heavier than the air around it. I blinked, and it was still there. I blinked again, and it was slightly closer. By the time I reached for the door handle, it was standing just outside the driver's side window, its bronze disc vibrating so intensely that the glass began to mist. I realized then that I was the only one who could see it. I could hear the hum, but to any observer, I was simply a person sitting in a silent car. I eventually drove home, the Auditor trailing behind me like a loyal, metallic hound, keeping pace with the headlights. The strangeness intensified the next evening. I was in my kitchen, preparing a simple meal of toasted bread and tea. I set my smartphone on the wooden counter, the screen facing up, and decided to step into the living room to find a book. I left the phone there, completely still. 5 minutes later, I heard a faint, rhythmic clicking from the kitchen. I looked back. The Auditor was there, perched on the counter like a gargoyle. Its copper plates were rattling. It didn't have hands in the traditional sense. It had 3 protruding rods from its sides that moved with fluid grace. One of the rods was touching the phone, and the bronze disc was spinning slowly. I felt a jolt of electricity in my teeth. I walked back in and whispered, "Are you recording?" The Auditor didn't speak, but the bronze disc flashed a dull, warm gold. It leaned its weight toward the phone, and the screen flickered. I realized it wasn't just watching, it was documenting. I took the phone back into my bedroom and laid it on my nightstand. I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the kitchen was silent, but the phone was still on the counter. I picked it up and opened the voice recorder app. My heart skipped. There was a 3-minute recording of the night's silence, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the sound of metal sliding against wood, the deep hum of the bronze disc, and a series of sharp, deliberate clicks. It had been recording the kitchen while I slept. The auditor hadn't just been sitting there. It had been moving through the room, exploring the corners, recording the way the shadows fell over the toaster and the way the steam from the kettle vanished. I tried to leave the kitchen, but the auditor followed me, its copper plates clinking softly. It seemed to be seeking more data. I sat at the table and watched it. It moved with a strange, hitching motion, like a clockwork toy being wound by an invisible hand. It reached out a rod and tapped the rim of my teacup. "What are you looking for?" I asked. The bronze disc spun rapidly, emitting a sound like 1,000 tiny bells. It then moved to the wall, pressing its metallic body against the wallpaper. It stayed there for an hour, perfectly still. I realized that it wasn't just recording the objects, it was recording the absence of movement. It was cataloging the stillness of my home. By the time I went to bed that night, I felt a heavy sense of observation. The auditor was no longer just a visitor, it was a permanent resident of my perception. I placed the phone in the center of the kitchen table and went to sleep, hoping it would find something new to note. In the morning, I found the phone again. The recording was longer, 10 minutes of pure, uninterrupted sound. But as I listened, I realized something terrifying. There were voices in the recording. They weren't my voices, and they weren't the auditor's. They were the sounds of dozens of other voices, layered over one another, whispering in a language that sounded like grinding stones. They were the sounds of every other kitchen the auditor had visited, all being played back at once. The auditor wasn't just recording my kitchen, it was archiving the entire world, one room at a time. I stood in the center of the room, feeling the copper plates of the entity vibrate against my skin as it hovered near my shoulder. It leaned its bronze disc toward my ear, and for the first time, I heard it speak. It wasn't a word, but a sequence of notes that sounded like a door closing in a very large house. I looked at the phone, then at the entity, and finally at the empty space in the corner of the room where I knew something else was waiting to be recorded. I realized that the auditor wasn't finished with my kitchen yet. It was merely waiting for me to stop moving so it could capture the sound of my breath. I sat down, held my breath, and watched the bronze disc begin to spin once more, capturing the exact moment my heart stopped beating in anticipation. The feedback of the hollow peak. The trail was supposed to be a simple loop, a 3-hour trek through the pine-heavy lungs of the northern range. By late afternoon, the sunlight began to fray at the edges, turning the vibrant greens of the needles into bruised shades of indigo. I was hiking alone, the rhythmic crunch of my boots providing the only percussion to the silence. Then, the first sound arrived, not from the woods, but from the air itself. It was a thin, electronic hum, a needle-sharp whine that seemed to vibrate against my teeth. I stopped, expecting a breeze or a distant stream, but the air was perfectly still. I spoke aloud to test the silence. "Is anyone there?" The hum didn't just echo, it modulated. It vibrated for a microsecond, then surged back at me in a perfect, distorted mimicry of my own voice, though it carried a metallic, shivering texture. It wasn't an echo. It was an answer. I felt a prickle of unease at the base of my spine. I took another step, my shadow stretching out like a pool of spilled ink. "Hello," I whispered. "Hello," the whine returned, this time with a slight delay, as if the sound were traveling through water. It was louder now, a constant drone that lived in the space between the trees. It felt as though the forest were a giant, hollow instrument, and the sound was the note held by a single, invisible string. I began to walk faster, my pace turning into a jog. The whine climbed in pitch, sharpening until it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. As the light failed completely, the woods transformed into a cathedral of silhouettes. The whine began to shift. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was becoming a texture. It felt like a seam in reality, a vibrating fold of air that moved toward me. I could see the way the atmosphere rippled, like heat haze over a summer road, but the heat was cold. I stopped in a small clearing where the pines stood thickest. "Who is speaking?" I shouted, my voice cracking in the heavy atmosphere. The whine responded with a violent crescendo. It folded inward, collapsing from a wide, surrounding drone into a concentrated point of resonance. It was the sound of 1,000 violins being tuned at once, all screaming at the exact same frequency. And then, the fold opened. From the center of the noise, a mouth appeared. It didn't belong to a face, it was a mouth that existed independently in the air. It was a jagged, pulsing rift, the color of a bruised plum. It didn't have teeth, but rather a row of crystalline ridges that caught the faint moonlight. The lips were thick and wet, rippling like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. It was a mouth that drank the sound, pulling the wine into itself. It hovered 3 feet in front of my face. It didn't move, but it breathed. Each exhale released a puff of silver mist that smelled of old copper and ozone. It was waiting. "Are you hungry?" I asked, my voice trembling. The mouth widened. The ridges vibrated, creating a shimmering halo of sound that made the nearby pines sway without a breeze. It wasn't just listening to my words, it was swallowing the vibration of them. I realized then that it wasn't a creature of flesh, but a creature of frequency. It was a pocket of the universe that had caught a sound and decided to keep it. It began to lean forward, the ridges clicking like a clock. The whine grew so intense that I felt my own bones vibrate. The mouth opened wider, revealing a throat that looked like a tunnel lined with velvet. It didn't just take my voice, it took the silence around me. The forest went mute. The wind died. The only thing left was the hum, the fold, and the mouth. I felt a sudden, magnetic pull. My own voice began to be drawn out of my throat, not by my breath, but by the suction of that hovering rift. I didn't speak, yet my voice came out a long, drawn-out "Aya" that was caught by the mouth and held. It didn't let go. It held my sound, stretched it, and then folded it again. I realized with a jolt of terror that the mouth wasn't just eating my words, it was storing them. It was a library of every sound it had ever captured. I could hear faint, ghostly echoes within its throat, the chirp of a bird from a mile away, the crack of a branch from an hour ago, and the distant, muffled roar of a waterfall. It was a scavenger of the acoustic world. Then it moved. It didn't fly or crawl. It simply shifted its position, sliding through the air like a bead of oil on water. It moved closer until the velvet throat was nearly touching my nose. The whine reached a fever pitch, a shimmering note that felt like it was trying to shatter my skull. I held my breath, afraid that even a tiny exhale would be devoured. The mouth pulsed. The ridges glowed with a dim, phosphorescent light. It was preparing for the final movement. It didn't want to just hear me, it wanted to inhabit me. It lunged, not with teeth, but with a sudden expansion of its fold. It wrapped around my head like a warm, vibrating veil. For a second, the world was nothing but sound, a roar of pure, unadulterated frequency that tasted like salt. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the mouth snapped shut. Silence returned, deeper than any silence I had ever known. I stood in the dark, my head spinning, the air still smelling of copper. I opened my mouth to speak, to see if I still had my voice, but no sound came out. The mouth was gone, but I could still feel it hovering just behind my ears, a phantom weight. I realized then that it hadn't just taken my voice, it had taken my ability to produce it, leaving me to hear the internal hum of its digestion. The Luminescent Inheritance. I inherited my aunt's estate under a very specific set of legal instructions. The will was a sprawling, parchment document that seemed to grow longer every time I read it, adding new clauses as if the ink were still wet. The primary directive was simple: the house belonged to me, provided I never felt truly alone. However, the clauses expanded as I moved in. Clause 4 stated that guests were welcome, but only if they brought a gift of sound. Clause 9 dictated that the furniture must never be rearranged during a full moon. But it was the final, most peculiar clause that kept me awake. The house is a vessel for the guest of glow. He who is never saved in your memory shall know exactly when you have returned. At first, I thought it was poetic nonsense. I lived in the sprawling Victorian, but the only thing that truly felt missing from my internal inventory was the face of the stranger who had saved me from the river 3 years ago. I never took the time to name him, nor did I save his likeness in my mind. He was simply the contact, the anonymous face of my survival. One Tuesday, the house felt particularly heavy. I was sitting in the hallway, the silence thick enough to taste, when the overhead chandelier began to pulse. It wasn't a flicker, It was a rhythmic inhalation of brightness. The warm yellow glow of the bulbs began to drain away, sucked into the center of the ceiling as if the light were being inhaled by a starving lung. Then I saw him. He emerged from the shadow of the banister, and my breath hitched in my throat. He was a towering, architectural marvel of dead light bulbs. He didn't have a solid body in the traditional sense. His torso was a cluster of frosted glass spheres, and his limbs were composed of interconnected filaments of wire. He didn't walk so much as he shifted, his body chiming like a crystal chandelier caught in a breeze. He was the guest of glow. As he moved across the floor, the room grew dimmer with every step he took. He was a thief of luminescence. Where his head, a massive, glowing orb of cracked glass, passed, the shadows deepened. He didn't have a face, yet he seemed to look at me with 1,000 tiny points of light. He moved toward the kitchen, and the overhead light there vanished instantly, the energy migrating into his crystalline ribcage. "Are you home?" He seemed to hum, though no sound left his mouth. It was the vibration of glass against glass. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs. The house was becoming a cavern of velvet darkness, save for the entity itself. He was the brightest thing in the world, a walking supernova of amber and white. He moved with a strange, fluid grace, his wire ribs expanding and contracting. He didn't just inhabit the room, he consumed the room's potential to shine. I realized then why the will had specified a contact who was never saved. This entity was the physical manifestation of everything we forget to notice. He lived in the periphery of our consciousness. Because I hadn't saved him in my mind, he had been waiting in the shadows of the house, starving for the light I provided just by existing in his presence. He glided toward me now. The floorboards beneath his feet lost their color, turning a dull, matte charcoal as he drank the very essence of the wood. He reached out a limb, a series of interconnected teardrop bulbs, and touched my shoulder. The moment he made contact, the warmth of the room vanished. The light he had stolen from the ceiling and the walls flowed into me, making my skin glow with a faint, ghostly radiance. "You are here," he hummed, the vibration rattling my teeth. He leaned his massive glass head forward, his filaments brushing against my forehead. For a moment, I could see his internal structure, the way the wires intertwined like a nervous system, and how the dead bulbs pulsed with a secondary life. He wasn't just a creature of light. He was the keeper of the light we leave behind. The house fell into a profound, absolute silence. The chandelier was dark. The walls were muted. There was only the glow of his body and the faint shimmer of my own skin. He settled into a corner, his body finally full, the room content to be dim. He stayed there, a magnificent, humming statue of glass and wire. I sat on the floor beside him, watching the way his filaments trembled. He was no longer hungry, but as he settled, a new clause seemed to manifest in my mind, as if the house were still writing its own rules. "The guest of glow is satisfied," I whispered into the gloom. He pulsed once, a soft, rhythmic beat of amber light. He didn't move, but the way he sat, slightly turned toward the door, suggested he was waiting for the next thing to arrive. I realized then that he wasn't just visiting. He was the reason the house felt so empty when I was away. He was the shadow that waited for the light to return. I reached out to touch his side, and my hand felt cold as it met the frosted glass. He was beautiful, but as I looked at the way his wires stretched toward the ceiling, I noticed something new. There was a small, tiny bulb at the very tip of his leading wire, one that hadn't been there before. It was flickering, desperately trying to catch a spark of light that wasn't there, waiting for me to give it something to hold on to. I closed my eyes, but the glow of his body remained burned into my retinas. Even in the dark, I could feel him watching me, his glass body humming a low, steady note of hunger. I realized that the house wasn't just his home, I was his fuel. When I finally drifted off to sleep, the last thing I felt was his weight leaning slightly closer to my chair, his filaments reaching out to drink the very last of my thoughts. The echo of the velvet room. Please, Mr. Eris, just answer the question. What did you see first when the house lights went out? I'll wait. I watched the showroom transition from a place of commerce to a place of silence. It was 9 p.m., and the heavy industrial lights had hummed into extinction, leaving only the moonlight filtering through the skylights. The showroom was a labyrinth of staged bedrooms, each a perfect microcosm of domestic life. There were heavy mahogany beds, lace-trimmed linens, and chairs upholstered in deep forest greens. It was peaceful until the air began to thicken. I stood in the center of the aisle, and that is when I noticed the discrepancy in the far corner. There was a door, a heavy, arched thing of dark oak, that wasn't on the floor plan. It stood alone, perpendicular to a velvet-draped bed. When I walked toward it, I realized it wasn't a door to another room in the building. It was a door to a different sky. I peered through the frame and saw a violent, bruised purple firmament where clouds moved in rhythmic pulses, far different from the ceiling above us. But it was the sound that truly unsettled me. A rhythmic thumping began. It wasn't the sound of a footstep, but the sound of a heartbeat. And then, the echo started. Just before a heavy thud hit the floor, I heard the ghost of that thud, a perfect, crystalline replication occurring exactly 1 second before the physical impact. It was as if the room was rehearsing its own existence. I took a step forward, and a moment before my heel struck the wood, a sharp clack echoed from the shadows. I froze. Something was moving in the velvet-draped bed. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. It was a mass of iridescent, overlapping scales, like those of a moth but larger, shimmering with a dull copper hue. It had no limbs, just an undulating body that moved like a ribbon of silk caught in a breeze. I watched it rise. It didn't just move, it prepared to move. I heard a soft, wet slide, and then, a second later, the creature actually slid across the linen. It was a mimic of causality. It lived in the gap between will and is. I tried to speak, but my voice felt delayed. I opened my mouth, and a second after the breath left my lungs, the sound of my own gasp reached my ears. The creature began to approach. It moved with a stuttering grace, its copper scales clicking against the floorboards. Each click was preceded by a faint, metallic chime. It was gathering speed, closing the distance between the velvet bed and my own chest. I felt the pressure of its presence. It was huge now, a shimmering mountain of scales that reached my shoulders. It didn't have a mouth, but it had a ridge of vibrating filaments along its spine. It began to hum a low, vibrating note. A second later, the room itself resonated with that same deep drone. I reached out a hand, terrified to touch it, because I knew that the sensation of the texture would arrive a heartbeat after the contact. The creature lunged. It didn't strike me immediately. It hovered, its copper scales rippling like a disturbed pond. Then it opened its spine wide, revealing a core of glowing amber light. It let out a long, melodic whistle. A second later, the air itself seemed to sigh in perfect harmony. It leaned in, and I felt the warmth of its body. It wasn't just mimicking the room, it was mimicking my very existence. It began to pulse. Every time it pulsed, I felt the ghost of the vibration in my bones before the actual motion occurred. It was the master of the almost. Then, the creature did something unexpected. It stopped mimicking the room and began to mimic me. It pulled its scales back, trying to form a shape that resembled a human torso. It was clumsy, a masterpiece of imperfect imitation. I watched as it tried to replicate my wide-eyed stare. It didn't have eyes, but the way the copper scales gathered at the front of its body suggested a focus. It leaned in close, its filaments vibrating against my cheek. I could feel its intent. It was trying to find the now it wanted to be, in the same moment as me. Suddenly, the creature surged forward, its scales flattening against my skin. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a physical presence, a shimmering weight. I realized then that the door to the purple sky was widening. The sky began to bleed into the showroom, the bruised clouds pouring over the furniture like spilled ink. The creature stayed pressed against me, its body vibrating with a frantic energy. It was trying to catch up to the present. It was trying to bridge the gap between the echo and the event. I felt its copper scales tickle my skin, and just as I felt the sensation, it solidified into a permanent state. The room fell silent. The echo was gone. The creature remained, perfectly still, mimicking the silence of the room. It stayed there, a shimmering, copper monument to the second before. It didn't move, but I could see it trying to decide what to do next. It waited for the next moment to happen so it could react to it. I realized that it wasn't just a creature of the room, it was a creature of the next. It stayed there, pressed against my ribs, waiting for me to move so it could follow. I took a deep breath, ready to step back into the safety of the lights. But as I moved, the creature didn't move with me. It stayed exactly where it was, perfectly mimicking the moment I had just left. It was now the ruler of my past, and I was the only thing left in the present. I looked down at its copper scales, still shimmering in the dim light. I realized that even though it was still trying to catch the movement of my heart. I felt it pulse against my chest. It was waiting for the next beat. And then, just as I prepared to turn away, I felt a small, copper scale twitch against my skin, perfectly mimicking a blink I hadn't even made yet. I realized that it wasn't just following me anymore, it was starting to predict me, and it was getting faster every second. The reverse breath of Tunnel 42. The postcards arrived in my mailbox in a chaotic jumble, their dates scrambled and their handwriting shifting from my own neat cursive to a frantic, jagged script that felt more like a physical ache. The first one, dated 3 days from now, read, "The dinner is prepared. Don't forget to save a seat." The second, dated yesterday, was written in a messy, looping hand. "I am hungry, but the chair is still empty." By the third day, the handwriting had smoothed into a perfect, elegant print. "You are late for the table." I sat in my kitchen, holding the latest card, wondering who was sending them. The ink was still wet, as if it had just been pressed onto the paper by a hand that wasn't entirely human. Then, the invitation arrived, written in a script so shaky it looked like it had been carved by a trembling thumb. "Come to the maintenance tunnel. The guest is waiting." I didn't know what the guest was until I descended into the belly of the city. The subway maintenance tunnel between the 4th Street and 9th Avenue stations was a cathedral of concrete and silence. It was a place of damp stone and the lingering scent of ozone. I walked for 20 minutes, my footsteps echoing like a steady heartbeat against the floor. The air was thick, heavy enough to taste. Then I heard it. It wasn't a sound, but a sensation. A rhythmic, localized vacuum. It was the sound of a breath being pulled inward, not exhaled outward. It was a slow, sucking pull of air, as if the atmosphere were being inhaled by a great, invisible lung. I turned the corner and stopped. There, in the center of the wide walkway, sat a table made of smooth, white marble. It was set for 2. At the head of the table sat the guest. It did not look like a ghost or a monster in the traditional sense. It had a body composed of woven, iridescent silk that shimmered like oil on water. Instead of a face, it had a wide, porcelain white mask with 3 vertical slits where a mouth should be. It had no eyes, but its skin seemed to ripple with the motion of the air it consumed. "Is it ready?" the guest asked. Its voice didn't travel through the air. It seemed to vibrate directly inside my skull. "I am here," I replied, my voice trembling in the vast space. The guest didn't move, but the air around it surged. It drew a massive gulp of oxygen toward itself, and the dust on the table flew toward the porcelain mask like a swarm of tiny moths. It was a reverse breath, a constant, hungry intake that never released. It made the surrounding air feel pressurized, as if the tunnel were a giant lung trying to swallow the world. "You are late," the guest said, and as it spoke, the silk of its body rippled in a deep, violet hue. I sat down, the marble chair feeling colder than the surrounding stone. We began to eat, though there was no food on the plates, only small, glowing spheres of amber light. Each time I took a bite, the guest took a corresponding pull of air. The sucking sound was constant, a soft, wet thrum as it dragged the atmosphere toward its mask. The further into the tunnel we went, the louder the pulling became. It felt as though the guest was trying to pull the very walls of the tunnel toward its face. "Do you like the soup?" it asked. I looked at the amber sphere in my spoon. It tasted of memories, the smell of rain on hot pavement, the sound of a distant bell. "It is delicious," I whispered. "Good," the guest replied. Its mask tilted slightly, and the 3 slits widened. I find that the flavor is enhanced by the effort of the intake. As we finished the final sphere, a strange silence fell. The sucking sound stopped. The air in the tunnel became perfectly still, almost stagnant. The guest sat back, its silk body settling into a dull, matte texture. "You have been a wonderful host," it said. "And you were a wonderful guest," I replied, feeling a strange sense of completion. I stood up to leave, but as I moved, I realized the guest hadn't moved an inch, yet the table was gone. The marble, the chairs, the amber spheres all vanished in a blink. The guest remained, sitting on the floor, its mask facing me. It didn't stand up. It didn't wave. It simply waited. "Will I see you again?" I asked. The guest didn't answer immediately. It took a deep, final breath, drawing the air from the entire tunnel into its mask with such force that my hair whipped toward it. The porcelain slits flared wide, revealing a depth that seemed to go on forever. "You are already part of the menu," the guest whispered. I looked down at my own hands. They were beginning to turn into woven silk, shimmering with a faint, oily light. I felt the air being pulled from my chest, not by my lungs, but by the guest's constant, hungry demand. I realized then that the postcards hadn't been a sequence of events, but a countdown. The guest wasn't just eating the amber spheres, it was eating the space around them, and eventually, it would eat the person who sat across from it. I stood up, my limbs feeling heavier, more fluid. I took a step back, but my heel didn't hit the ground. It sank into the floor as if the concrete were becoming soft. The guest reached out a hand, not a hand with fingers, but a waving ribbon of silk. It touched my shoulder, and I felt a cold, steady tug. "Don't worry," the guest said, its voice now sounding like a fading echo. "The next guest won't have to wait as long." I looked at the mask one last time before my own face began to smooth over into porcelain. I realized that the guest wasn't just sitting in the tunnel, it was the tunnel's owner, and I was the latest addition to its collection. I felt my body stretch and fold, my skin smoothing out, my senses merging with the silk. I wasn't a person anymore. I was a texture, a shape, a lingering note of color. As the last of my humanity faded, I felt the guest lean forward. "Now," the guest whispered, its voice vibrating through my new silk skin. "Shall we begin the next course?" I opened my mouth to speak, but instead of a word, a small puff of air escaped, drawn inward by the vacuum of the mask that was now my own. The curator of the receding void. The shopping mall had been dead for 20 years, a concrete ribcage of steel and glass rotting in the suburbs. I took the job as a night shift janitor because I wanted the silence, but I didn't realize that the silence on the loading dock was heavy, almost liquid. The dock was a vast, flat expanse of cracked asphalt, smelling of damp cement and old cardboard. At the far end, where the shadows pooled deepest, the tide had gone out. I didn't mean the ocean. I meant the literal fabric of reality. It started as a small ripple in the air, a spot where the colors seemed to drain away, leaving a pocket of perfect, hollow nothingness. It was a hole in the middle distance, a rupture in the scenery that felt like a physical weight. Every time I tried to stare directly at it, my eyes would slip off its surface like water sliding off a glass marble. It was hard to pin down, a constant motion of the periphery, a dead of space that the world hadn't quite filled in yet. By the second week, the hole began to grow. It wasn't a hole in the ground, but a hole in the view. It was roughly the size of a carriage, a shimmering void that possessed a texture like crushed velvet mixed with static. It didn't have a shape so much as it had a presence. It was a vacuum that pulled the dust toward it, but the dust never landed. It simply orbited the edge of the void in a slow, rhythmic dance. I found myself walking toward it more often, my heavy broom clicking against the asphalt. The sound of the broom felt muffled, as if the closer I got, the more the air became dense, like wading through invisible honey. On the third week, the entity within the hole revealed itself. It wasn't a creature in the traditional sense, but a collection of impossible geometries. It looked like a cluster of floating, translucent prisms, each one the color of a bruised plum. These prisms didn't move on limbs. They drifted, rotating around a central core of pulsing amber light. When I finally stopped 10 feet away and forced my eyes to stay steady, the prisms began to vibrate. They hummed a low, subharmonic frequency that I felt in my teeth more than I heard in my ears. It was the sound of a secret being whispered by 1,000 voices at once. Are you watching? I whispered to the void, my breath hitching in the cool night air. The prisms reacted instantly. They didn't spin faster, but they shifted inward, creating a ripple of color that washed over the asphalt. It was then that I noticed the tide. The void was pulling the mall into itself. Not the physical building, but the essence of it. The smell of old popcorn and floor wax began to bleed into the hole. I could see the ghost of a neon sign, flickering in the center of the prisms, though no sign existed on the loading dock. The hole was consuming the history of the mall, archiving it in its own private gallery. By the end of the month, the hole had claimed half the dock. The asphalt was no longer flat, it was curving inward, like a sheet of paper being folded by invisible hands. The further the tide receded, the more the environment felt less like a building and more like a memory. I felt my own shadow stretching toward the prisms, not because of a light source, but because the void was hungry for my silhouette. I stood paralyzed, my hand gripping the handle of my broom, watching as a discarded crate of apples began to lose its solidity, turning into a puff of violet mist as it touched the edge of the hole. Then the shift happened. The prisms stopped their rotation. They aligned into a perfect, vertical stack, and the amber light flared into a blinding, steady glow. The humming stopped, replaced by a profound, ringing silence. The hole wasn't just a vacuum anymore. It was a witness. It felt as though the void were a museum, and the prisms were the artifacts of a world that was being slowly unmade. I realized then that the tide wasn't just moving out, it was moving inward. Every second, the void took a little more of the world and stored it. It took the hum of the lights, the texture of the concrete, and the very weight of the air. I reached out a hand, my fingers trembling. As my skin touched the edge of the void, I didn't feel cold or hot. I felt a sensation of almost. I was almost there, almost gone, almost a memory. The prisms began to pulse in a slow, heartbeat rhythm. I could see my own reflection in the translucent surfaces, not a perfect mirror image, but a version of myself that looked slightly more vibrant, as if the whole were perfecting me as it consumed me. "And you are keeping it all," I murmured, my voice echoing as if the void were a cathedral. The prisms flared one last time, and a wave of deep, indigo light washed over the dock. The apples were gone. The crate was gone. The broom was dissolving into a string of golden sparks. The tide had reached the center of the dock, and I was standing at the very lip of the end. The void wasn't a hole anymore. It was a mouth, and it had finally finished its meal. The mall was no longer a place of commerce, but a collection of stolen moments held in a permanent, silent gallery. I took one final step forward. My boots left the asphalt and hung in the air for a heartbeat before sinking into the velvet static. I felt the prisms pull at my hair, my skin, my thoughts. The amber light swallowed my chest, and for a moment, I could see the entire history of the mall, the laughter of children, the squeak of sneakers, the heavy sighs of tired shoppers, all archived in those plum-colored shapes. The void didn't just hold the objects, it held the feeling of them. Then, the movement ceased. The prisms settled into a final, perfect arrangement. The dock was empty. The mall was gone. There was only the void, the museum of the lost, holding the fragments of what used to be. I felt my own body become one of the artifacts, a tiny speck of me suspended in the amber glow, waiting for the next thing to be swallowed. The tide had finished its journey, and the world was slightly less full than it had been a moment before. I looked back one last time at the world I had left behind, but there was nothing left to see except the thing that was now holding my place. I realized that the hole wasn't just a gap in the scenery. It was the only thing that remained when the scenery was finished. I am still here, a silent exhibit in a gallery that never ends, and I can feel the void slowly beginning to pull on the very edges of the air around your head. The echo of the second before. Entry 1. The flooded lower level of the Blackwood mine is not just a graveyard of coal, it is a subterranean lake of stillness. The water is deep, tea-colored, and perfectly flat. I am tasked with cataloging the apartment block, a series of stone rooms carved directly into the rock, submerged up to their doorframes. The air here tastes of wet slate and ancient soot. I am currently stationed in apartment 4C, a small cubicle of stone. It is mostly vacant, save for the water that laps against the floor like a heartbeat. I have spent 3 days here alone, recording the acoustics of the silence. Entry 4. The first anomaly occurred at 2:14 p.m. I was sitting on a stool, my notebook resting on my knee. From the far wall, the wall that separates 4C from the currently empty 4D, came a sound. It was a sharp, bubbly laugh. It was distinct, like a child catching their breath in delight. I froze. The room was silent. There was no one in 4D to laugh. I waited for a second sound, but none came. It was just a single, isolated burst of mirth. Entry 7. The laughter has returned, but it is becoming more frequent. However, I noticed something peculiar about the timing. Every time the laugh occurs in 4D, it feels as though the room is preparing for it. Just a split second before the sound breaks the silence, the water surface ripples in a perfect concentric circle, as if something invisible just tapped the surface. Entry 12. I have started to name the entity. I call it the precursor. It does not inhabit the space in a traditional sense. It seems to inhabit the moment before the sound happens. Today, I heard a sequence, a low, melodic chuckle, followed by a high-pitched giggle. But here is the terrifying part. I realized the laugh in 4D was not happening in real time. It was happening exactly 1 second before the physical vibration reached my ears. The water ripples, and then, a heartbeat later, the laugh echoes. Entry 15. The laughter is no longer just a sound. It is becoming a physical presence. I can see the water reacting to the ghost of the laugh. When the precursor laughs, a small puff of air seems to burst from the wall of 4D, sending a spray of tiny droplets toward my face. I sat perfectly still today and tried to predict it. I closed my eyes and waited. The water gave a tiny, shivering shudder. Then a dry, rasping laugh erupted from the wall. It sounded less like a human child now and more like 2 pieces of sandpaper rubbing together underwater. Entry 19. It is beginning to mimic more than just laughter. It is mimicking the actions of the room. Today, I heard the sound of a heavy door slamming shut in 4D. The sound was crisp and authoritative. But the door in 4D is still wide open. It is as if the precursor is rehearsing the room's future. It plays the sound of a door closing, and then, a moment later, the actual door swings shut on its own, pushed by an unseen weight. Entry 24. The precursor is getting closer. The wall between 4C and 4D feels thinner. I can see the entity's influence leaking through the cracks in the stone. It is no longer just the sound of laughter. It is the sound of a heavy object dragging across the floor, followed by the actual scrape of stone against stone. It is the sound of a sigh, followed by a literal gust of wind that ruffles my hair. It is living in the just about to be. Entry 30. I stayed awake all night. The laughter became constant. It was a frantic, bubbling series of notes. The precursor was no longer content with just the before sound. It began to mimic me. I took a deep breath, and a second later, a ghostly exhale mirrored mine from the wall. I blinked, and a wet click echoed from 4D. It is stealing my movements, my breaths, and my sounds, playing them back like a delayed shadow. Entry 35. I am terrified to move. If I move, the precursor will mimic me. If I speak, it will repeat me. The wall of 4D is now humming. It is a low, constant vibration of anticipation. The water in the room is beginning to swirl in a slow, hypnotic drain toward the center of the floor, even though there is no hole. The precursor is gathering its energy. It is no longer just a sound. It is a hunger. Entry 40. I heard it today. A sound I didn't make, but one that was about to happen. It was the sound of a footstep, a heavy, sodden thud. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, the thud occurred. But it wasn't just a sound. A wet, heavy weight actually pressed against the wall of 4D, pushing the stone inward as if something large was leaning against it from the other side. Entry 42, I decided to reach out. I put my hand against the wall of 4D, feeling the cold, damp stone. I wanted to see what was there. I held my breath, waiting for the precursor to mimic my stillness. Then, the water surface suddenly exploded outward. A sound erupted, not a laugh, but a wet, sucking noise, like a mouth opening wide. And then, the wall itself groaned. It didn't just make the sound of a wall groaning, it actually buckled inward, as if the precursor had finally decided to step through the before and into the now. Entry 45, it is here. The wall of 4D has collapsed, but the room is still empty of physical matter. There is no body. There is no creature with limbs or a face. There is only a shimmering distortion in the air, a ripple of heat and moisture. I can see it now, a cluster of glowing, amber-colored spheres that float like bubbles, each one representing a sound that hasn't happened yet. They drift toward me, and as they pass my ears, they emit tiny, faint chirps. I reached out to touch one, and before my finger made contact, I heard the sound of a bell tolling. My finger touched the sphere, and the bell rang. Entry 48. The laughter has stopped. The humming has stopped. The room is perfectly, unnaturally still. I am sitting on the floor, watching the amber spheres. One large sphere is drifting toward my face, growing brighter with every second. It is the loudest sound I have ever heard in my mind, though it hasn't reached my ears yet. I can feel the vibration in my teeth. I can feel the pressure in the air. I am waiting for the final sound. It is the sound of the precursor finally catching up to the present. I closed my eyes to wait for the crash. It happened. The sound of 1,000 glass jars shattering at once filled the room, but I didn't hear it until I was already standing in the middle of the shards. I realized then that the precursor wasn't just mimicking the sound of the room, it was mimicking the sound of the end. I am sitting in the center of the silence now, but the amber spheres are gone. There is only one left, hovering right in front of my nose. It is about to make its sound. I can feel the air thickening, the very molecules of the room preparing to scream. I am holding my breath, waiting for the sound of my own heart stopping, which I can hear echoing in my head a full second before my chest actually settles into its final rest. The Inventory of the Abyss. The transcript for episode 42 of Deep Pressure is famously the only one the host, Elias Thorne, never actually released. It was found in his voice recorder, dated 3 weeks after the rig went silent. The recording begins with the rhythmic, metallic groan of the Dagger 9, a deep-sea oil rig anchored in a trench so deep the sun feels like a memory. I sat in the galley, the hum of the machinery vibrating through my marrow. Down here, the pressure doesn't just push against the hull, it breathes against it. The metal skin of the rig becomes a screaming instrument, groaning under the weight of miles of water, a constant, haunting reminder of the crushing void outside. But the true horror began when the crew discovered the yielding patch on the rig's secondary deck, a small, perfectly square plot of seabed that seemed to defy the laws of physics. It wasn't just mud, it was a hungry expanse, a rectangle of absolute stillness amidst the churning currents. The crew started small, tossing lost tools and scrap metal into the patch. Every morning, they would find their items returned, but with a strange, geometric precision. A wrench tossed in at noon would be found at dawn, perfectly balanced on its side, as if it were resting on a velvet cushion. Then, things got strange. The rig began to feel crowded, not with people, but with returned objects. They didn't just come back, they came back with a subtle, physical transformation. A discarded boot would return with its leather turned to a strange, porcelain-like ceramic, cold and smooth to the touch. A rusted pipe would return smooth as polished marble, its jagged edges sanded down by some invisible, underwater artisan. The crew stopped throwing things away. They began to fear the yielding patch, for it seemed to be selecting what it liked and discarding what it didn't. If you threw a heavy chain into it, the patch might swallow it whole, only to spit it back out 3 days later, shimmering with a faint, bioluminescent pulse like a dying star. It was during the 14th day of the Great Burying that the entity first emerged. It didn't walk out of the patch, it simply coalesced from the mud like a bubble rising through water. It was a towering, wobbling pillar of stacked glass pill bottles, thousands of them, held together by a viscous, translucent amber resin. The bottles weren't just stacked, they were nested, some wide and squat, others tall and needle-thin, creating a labyrinthine architecture of glass. They hummed with a low, vibrating frequency that rattled the teeth of everyone on deck, a subsonic thrum that made the very air feel heavy. Most unsettling were the labels, or lack thereof. Each bottle was etched with a different, jagged rune that seemed to shift and dance when you weren't looking directly at it, as if the carvings were trying to escape the glass. The entity didn't have a face, but it had a voice. It spoke in a series of rhythmic clicks and rattles, like 1,000 marbles falling into a wooden bowl. Every night at exactly midnight, the entity would emerge from the patch and perform its ritual. It would vibrate, and the labels on its body would glow with a pale, ghostly light. Then, it would produce a sound, a dry, percussive snap, and a number would echo through the rig. On the first night, it rattled, 112. On the second night, it was 111. The crew watched in silence, mesmerized by the way the amber resin between the bottles would pulse with a faint, sickly green light. The entity was counting down. It was the inventory of the seabed, the tally of the deep. But as the days passed, the returns from the patch became more personal. The crew realized the patch wasn't just returning objects, it was returning memories. When Marcus, the lead engineer, threw in a broken compass, it returned a week later, but it was now accompanied by a small, perfectly formed pearl. When Sarah threw in a dried flower, it returned as a tiny, crystalline sphere that tasted of salt when she touched it. The entity seemed to be translating the essence of the objects into something more permanent, stripping away the mundane and leaving the soul of the thing behind. The countdown continued, a relentless, ticking clock in the middle of the ocean. 100, 99, 98. The atmosphere on the rig shifted from curiosity to a heavy, suffocating anticipation. The crew began to feel as though the patch was hungry for more than just metal and stone. It wanted the things that mattered. One night, during the countdown of 50, Elias noticed the entity had begun to change. The bottles at the top were starting to crack, leaking a thick, silvery liquid that pooled at the base of the stack. The liquid didn't drip. It flowed upward, defying gravity, coating the lower bottles in a shimmering film that looked like liquid mercury. The crew realized the entity wasn't just counting down to 0, it was counting down to its own completion. On the night of 10, the rig was hit by a massive undersea tremor. The yielding patch surged, and the entity didn't just rattle, it roared, a sound like 1,000 wine glasses shattering at once. The bottles began to spin, orbiting a central core of pure, white light. The crew stood paralyzed as the count reached 3. The air became thick with the scent of ozone and old parchment. Then came 2. The entity grew taller, its bottles stretching into elongated cylinders, the amber resin turning a deep, bruised purple. The vibrations were so intense that the metal floor of the rig began to hum in harmony, a low moan that felt like the earth itself was sighing. The crew held their breath, their hearts beating in sync with the rhythmic rattling of the glass. Finally, the moment arrived. The entity reached the final number. It didn't speak it with a rattle. It spoke it with a resonance that felt like a physical weight pressing against their chests. 1. The bottles stopped spinning. The amber resin solidified into a hard, obsidian shell. The white light at the center flared once, blindingly bright, and then vanished, leaving only the scent of wet earth. The entity stood still, a perfect monument of glass and resin. Then, it let out one final, tiny click. 0. The bottles didn't shatter. Instead, they all imploded simultaneously, pulling inward toward the center. For a second, there was total silence. Not a single drop of water moved, not a single piece of metal groaned. Then, the patch gave one final, violent heave. It didn't just return what was buried, it returned everything. Every tool, every pearl, every crystalline sphere, and every scrap of metal flew out of the mud at once, coating the rig in a chaotic rain of treasures. But as the dust settled, Elias looked down at the patch. It was empty. The entity was gone, and the patch had smoothed over into a flat, featureless plain of gray silt. He walked to the edge of the mud and saw a single, new object sitting perfectly in the center. It was a small, glass bottle identical to the ones that had made up the entity. It hadn't been there a moment ago. He reached down and touched it, feeling the warmth of the glass. He peered inside, expecting to see a rune or a pearl. Instead, he saw a tiny, perfectly preserved miniature of himself, his face frozen in a look of permanent, silent shock. He realized then that the patch hadn't just been counting down to zero, it had been counting down the remaining capacity of the world. He looked back at the empty patch and realized that the next thing it would return would be the very thing he was currently holding. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories and make sure to like.